We are going to energise the country.
Stop Brexit.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Seamus, I'm not sure this is a great idea either.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated Podcast. I'm your host Will, and in this episode I'm joined by Chris Yu, who is the Executive Director of Technology of the Technology and Public Policy team at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Hi, great to be here.
Firstly, I'd like to ask, because Brexit has obviously been something that has been predominantly in the headlines recently, and one of the main issues over Brexit is the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Now, a lot of Conservative MPs have suggested that technology of some form or another could be used to prevent a hard border. What do you think of such suggestions?
Yeah, well, I think you put your finger on it. Technology of some form or other, and nobody, as far as I can make out, has actually made a concrete proposal. So, I don't doubt in future somebody will come up with something clever in the here and now. I don't think it exists. I think one of our former chancellors invoked blockchain at one point, but that didn't seem to go anywhere.
Do you think that perhaps the idea of using technology is sort of often a get out of jail free card for people who are legislating, that they'll say, oh, there'll just be some technology and that will get around the issue?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that tends to happen when politicians talk about tech, and that is one of them. And you see it in other instances. Like the one that strikes me most obviously is some of the debate about end-to-end encryption on messaging services. You remember politicians of different persuasions often coming to the same conclusion, which is, yes, encryption and privacy are important. On the other hand, we also want to be able to access the messages of certain individuals of interest, and I can see the justification for that. And then they just kind of push out, technologists are bright and clever and well-resourced. Somebody just needs to figure out an answer to this. Even when actually, when you look at something like encryption, it's sort of mathematically impossible, right? To build a system which is going to be secure, but also let people in via a backdoor when you think that it's a sensible situation to do that. And it's one of the big struggles, and I think it stems from a kind of broader, lack of understanding of just what is possible and how the world has changed. The other thing that you get, aside from kind of pushing it on for these magical solutions, is just a kind of head in the sand denial that anything is happening, and people, arguing actually we want to go backwards rather than forwards. And you can have your sympathy with that or not, but the truth is you can't go back.
Now, before we move on to discussing the papers for the Institute, I'd just like to ask, in Anthony Giddens' book The Third Way, he argues that a combination of the freeing nature of the welfare state and economic policies of Thatcherism, there became less of an emphasis on collective responsibility and more of an onus on individuality. Now, how do you think tech can help to restore a sense of community? And do you think that perhaps technology has been partly responsible for a wrecking of community, a sort of placing more influence on the individual rather than community?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's one of the things which we turn over all the time when we're kind of debating this stuff. That you've got simultaneously, you might say that lots of the technologies have at their core a very atomistic view of the world. That all of the kind of platforms and marketplaces that have been enabled by tech tend to boil things down to individual agents and transactions, and destroy some of the some of the richer interactions that we maybe had in the past. On the other hand, I can absolutely see the argument that it has also generated new forms of community, and whether you want to think of that as being your kind of circle of friends on Facebook, or whether you want to think about it as being a global initiative like Wikipedia. There are new forms of organising and people coming together that weren't possible before. So, I'm not kind of in the camp of thinking that it's all kind of, it's all benign or it's all terrible. I definitely think it's different, and I definitely think the policy and our politics to some extent have not caught up. And and you see this really coming to the fore in numerous different debates at the moment. And the big question for me is, how do we, there's a bunch of stuff which has been challenging, and serious missteps have been made by the technology sector, but there ought to be opportunities to reinvigorate democracy, to bring people together, to rebuild communities and find new ways of forging connections between people. And the question is, how do we turn the same energy that we've put into building these, multi-billion-dollar companies to those sorts of social purposes without breaking all the incentives and innovation that made them what they were?
And just picking up on what you said, that it can create greater connections. Earlier this year, the Institute published a paper on education and technology. It's a very interesting paper. And one of the arguments that you and the other co-authors of the paper make is that technology can be used to augment traditional learning resources. Now, how do you think that we can ensure that if we are using technology to augment traditional resources like teaching in the classroom and the way that children interact with teachers, how can we ensure that this doesn't depersonalise the learning experience?
Yeah. Well, I think we talk about augmenting and enhancing rather than replacing. It seems to me, even in the broader debate around like automation and the kind of digitization of different tasks and services, that the very kind of real, rich human interactions that you find in teaching, in care professions, are going to be some of the last that computers take over for us. So the question is, how do you do this in a way which is alive to not just the needs of the learners, but also enables teachers to do their best work? And for me, I think it's there ought to be huge opportunity, not in terms of sticking more iPads into classrooms, although there's obviously a place for that. But it's think about the situations where students can't afford textbooks, or you haven't got teachers who are sufficiently expert in particular topics in some parts of the world. The idea that actually you can use the internet to stream classes with the best teachers on the planet to kids everywhere is incredible. And when you look at the data on, particularly for the developing world, the number of people who are young people now who are likely to reach adulthood without the skills they need is terrifying. And there's no way without technology that we can solve that.
And one of the other interesting points that you mentioned is the idea of linking classrooms and having sort of like interaction between different classrooms that could be, quite a distance away. Do you think that something like that could be used as a good way to tackle the sort of like the negativity that certain people have towards globalization, if they're more able to interact from a young age with people perhaps on the other side of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things that the Institute's been involved in for a number of years is facilitating these sorts of connections. And the rationale is pretty simple, right? That actually, if you haven't got those relationships and that sort of exposure, then people in different situations in different countries can feel very distant and very opaque. And of course, when you bring groups of young people together like this, what you realise is that sure, you might be in different environments, and the towns and cities you live in might look and feel different, and the stuff you eat for breakfast or lunch is different, but actually, young people around the world have a lot in common, and it's often takes that connection in order for people to really realise that, and that people who've been they've often thought of as very different maybe aren't so different after all.
Another interesting point that is raised is you mentioned Junilingo and Langbot as means of personalising education, that these sort of like platforms can be used to interact with students more. There are also other companies like Dada, ABC, which provide similar services. Do you think that there is perhaps a worry that if these companies are involved with the learning process without any sort of overarching legislation, that they could perhaps not be doing what we would hope that they should be doing in a learning environment.
Yeah, I think your question touches on a broader issue around the extent to which corporations now have such sway over different aspects of our lives. And so this question around regulation is as pertinent here as it is in many other domains. It seems to me that one of the interesting parts of the education debate is this kind of distinction between sort of personalized tuition and personalized curricula, and the broader kind of purpose of teaching in a learning environment. And one of the challenges that I see in lots of the education technology is that most of the more advanced applications tend to be ones where you kind of apply the technology to break things down and drill people for test and be able to quickly retrieve facts, this kind of stuff. Some of the more interesting and more nascent arenas, I think, are the ones where you try to figure out how do you deliver a much more rounded educational experience that gives people the content, but also helps people with their critical thinking skills and their interaction and their interpersonal skills. And that stuff's genuinely harder, but I also think probably where most of the value is going to end up.
Now, I'd just like to move on and to talk to a paper that the Institute published that was written by itself in 2017, Technology for the Many, a Public Policy Platform for a Better, Fairer Future. It's a great paper that I would encourage anybody listening to read to get a broader understanding of the issues that are tackled. And one question that I'd like to ask regarding this paper is one example that you use of how drones can help is that they can help in enabling hospital supplies to be delivered to remote regions, often regions that have been hit by floods or earthquakes or other such natural disasters. Do you think that with the likes of Amazon proposing that they will be using drones to deliver items, do you think that drones are here to stay and are going to contribute greatly to the future of aviation?
That is such a good question. I think in my mind there's a couple of things in this, and they are related but they're not the same. So in the paper we talk about the scenario where maybe the traditional infrastructure is either not present or has been compromised. Your kind of example of natural disasters where you then have the ability to start to move things like medical supplies in ways that wouldn't have been possible previously, and that can be genuinely life-saving. And then I guess there's the wider debate about in sort of Western cities, where do we think this technology is going to take us? And it's one of these arenas where actually there isn't an awful lot. There's a bunch of rules and regulations and legislation that existed from previous eras that tries to govern this, and there's a few bolt-ons, but nobody has really thought through what is the transformational potential. So what you tend to see is as the technology improves and becomes cheaper and more accessible, you see more edge cases where there are transgressions that feel difficult, and then we kind of patch that with rules to prevent particular sorts of behaviour. Stepping back and answering the question, well, it seems like some of our cities are getting clogged up with delivery vans, and wouldn't it be good if we put some of those boxes in the sky? I don't know, maybe that's a good answer, maybe it's not, but we really struggle to have that conversation. So I think the kind of a lot depends on the regulatory environment, the extent to which we think we want to do a kind of way forward that embraces some of this technology and is responsive enough to enable different use cases and contain the risks, or whether we're going to be very much kind of in the mindset of we don't want things to be too different too quickly. So you may well see actually other parts of the world move ahead faster than we ever would in London or New York. You might look to the Middle East or to China potentially for how some of this stuff plays out in the near term.
Now, one of the other points that you touch upon in the 2017 report is that Labour has had the Labour Party has quite a strong history and connection with technology, Harold Wilson's famous white heat of technology remarks are some. Do you think that the current Labour Party is embracing technology in the way that you think that it perhaps should, and in a way that the paper suggests is the way forward?
I think we're probably a little bit away from that at the moment. It feels to me like, we talk a lot more, we hear a lot more from the Labour Party about its plans to nationalise the railways or whatever else than we do about the kind of big transformational impacts of technology. And I think that's a real shame because, there's obviously, there's one kind of libertarian Silicon Valley view of how this stuff plays out, but there's no reason why, the same technology shouldn't be used for, kind of serving the public interest and improving, the lot of, the general population. So that's the kind of arena which, we think very strongly, people ought to be paying a lot more attention to. And, I don't think it's just the Labour Party thing. I think, actually, in my mind, a lot of the, debates in tech are, they have a left or right element, but often the kind of much more dominant axis is this question of, are we going to embrace the future or are we going to resist it? And so, there aren't kind of straightforward answers to some of these trade-offs, but it's much easier for politicians who don't understand the technology to attack it than to say something positive about how they're going to make it work for people.
And you mentioned then that often because of the lack of understanding that politicians will attack what they don't quite understand. Do you think that because of this sort of lack of understanding and this irrational fear of technology that we both see in government and sometimes from the public, that we're being held back from fully embracing technology in a way that can improve our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it's malicious, right? I don't think that politicians are they're not stupid, but this stuff is genuinely complicated, right, and quite different from the world that we were dealing with in the past. And a lot of the responsibility lies with people in tech who maybe don't always explain this stuff in ways that make it easy for politicians to grapple with either. So I think there's this kind of the conversations that are misfiring on both sides, but absolutely it's holding us back. You think about the potential of technology in whatever field you like, right? Our ability to massively improve the quality of diagnoses in healthcare, or our ability to use existing technologies to massively improve the efficiency that cities run at so that they're not clogged with traffic and air pollution, or a dozen other areas. And we're nowhere near the level of ambition that you'd hope for amongst people who are aspiring to lead the country.
Now, just touching back on the 2017 paper, one of the factors that you mentioned, and you've mentioned during this podcast as well, is that often online we can connect with people much easier than we did in the past and form sort of communities online and all this sort of thing. Do you think that there is also a danger that this accessibility to being able to meet like-minded people has helped to stir and help to recruit organisations like ISIL, the far right in the UK and across Europe and in the US, and that this is something we have to be aware of when we're encouraging people to help create online communities?
Yeah. So there's no doubt about it that it's become easier to make those sorts of connections. And one of the things that people in this kind of environment commentary often talk about is the way the internet has destroyed traditional gatekeepers, right? Be it traditional media, broadcasters, political parties, all of the forces that in the past had for economic reasons and business model reasons but also just to do with the kind of structure of information, the ability to control and curate some of those conversations, and that's gone, right? And so the people who say, well, you should blame the internet for a particular electoral outcome or a particular candidate winning office. It's not the internet directly doing that, but it certainly created the conditions in which it's much easier for extremist views to be heard and to gain momentum. And so one of the things that we've talked about from the Institute and our work is around this question of how do you build a new type of regulation to handle these sorts of situations. And one of the big things for us is all of these places, whichever social network you're on, or many other platforms as well, right? In some way, shape, or form, they have community standards, or they call it different things in different places. But broadly speaking, right, the rules of the road, like what you are and aren't allowed to do, and what kind of behaviour is permissible. And the bit which is really missing at the moment is, there's a kind of legitimacy problem around those rules because they tend to be set unilaterally in boardrooms in California. And I think what's got to happen next is a much more engaged process where those sorts of rules and standards are set in consultation with with the people that use the platform, with our elected governments, with civil society, and not just putting our trust in the hands of a few execs. There's decisions about what's allowed and what's not allowed. But it's just genuinely difficult, right? That's a hard conversation to have, and one which a lot of companies are not really equipped for in the way that we might hope.
Now, you mentioned that a lot of these decisions are done often quite at a distance to the people that they impact and they affect upon. Now, a lot of different politicians across the political spectrum have been talking about breaking up social media companies and breaking up these larger social media platforms. Do you think that would have a positive effect, that it could allow people to have a greater connection if they were sort of like smaller and you were able to connect with them easy, or do you think that would have a negative effect on development?
I think that actually it betrays a kind of misunderstanding of the world that we're now dealing with. And the reason I say that is that when you step back and you look at the economics, the business incentives and the business structures of these companies and these sorts of markets, what you often find is when things are born on the internet like this, they have a tendency, natural tendency, to be markets in which you have one or a small number of large firms tend to be successful because of the network effects and the cost structure and so on and so forth. So to my mind, in lots of situations, sure, you can have the conversation about I want to break XYZ company up or split it into two different parts. If you do that and nothing else, it may only be a matter of time before either they roll back into each other, or something else becomes the large dominant thing, and we're going to go after that next. You think about a social network, right? So it has a lot of its value from the fact that you and all your friends are on it. Now, why don't I put 50% of your friends on one and 50% on another, and tell me whether that's more or less useful, right? It's probably not as good. So I think what we've got to figure out is, in the past we've used those kind of tools because they made sense for a world before the internet. Looking forwards, we've got to figure out, look, maybe we're not comfortable with some of the behavior of these companies or some of the outcomes, but we need a different sort of regulation. So we talk a lot about, how do you do this in a way which, accepts the fundamental nature of the markets that we're dealing with, and then puts in different rules and provisions to ensure that the way companies behave is aligned with the way that society would like them to act. But that's a very different approach and needs a different kind of mindset and different skill set. I often say to people, you need a regulator which is going to be able to go toe to toe with some of these big technology companies, which means you've got to hire the sort of people that these companies can hire, right? You've got to be as good at understanding algorithms and data and the speed at which they innovate. You've got to be as good at that as they are. And the same way that the people that we appoint to regulate financial services, know all the ins and outs of what it's like to work in the city and what, the way these companies and marketplaces move. And I think we're some way off that at the moment.
Now, something that is under review by the current government at the moment is HS2. Do you think that HS2 will have, if it is completed, will have a benefit to the UK and the infrastructure of the UK, or do you think that it's a white elephant?
That's an interesting question. And look, I'll be honest with you, I'm not an expert on HS2. Mm-hmm. I think there's something interesting to my mind around the kind of question of level of economic concentration in the south of England and what you need to do to open some of that up. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a kind of parallel conversation around, what are the, when you look, you step back and you ask the question, what sort of infrastructure do we need for the 21st century in a country like the UK? Then you've got your, traditional components, including, road and rail and so on. Mm-hmm. And then you've got the kind of parallel conversation about the other sort of technology and communications infrastructure, right? Fiber and 5G and everything else. Mm-hmm. So I think you've got to take it all together. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we talked about in the paper was actually, there's a pretty strong case to my mind for saying we ought to be embarking on a program of infrastructure build out that is incredibly ambitious. Mm-hmm. Because, we know you can look at the data on something like, fiber internet penetration in the UK versus other countries, and, a lot of places are a long way ahead of us. Mm-hmm. So connectivity, both real and digital, matter enormously. But as ever, right, with all this stuff, you see it with HS2, you see it with Heathrow and other arenas. Governments really struggle with these, decisions that have long-term consequences and, big kind of upfront costs. Politically, they're always the hardest ones to wrangle.
Now, you just mentioned fibre optic internet, fibre optic broadband. Why do you think that we have had such problems with developing that in Britain and spreading it across the entire United Kingdom as opposed to in other countries?
So I think some of it is to do, the genuine questions around sort of history and path dependence, right? So if you're earlier to put in copper phone lines, then it's harder to make the case for tearing those out and replacing them with different technology. Yeah. That's part of it. Some of it, I think, is a question of, where do you think you put the line between, public provision and, what you kind of expect the private sector to deliver. Mm-hmm. And so, with lots of the broadband debates, it's often been the case that, we kind of expect private companies to reach a certain proportion of the population, but it's not very clear to them that there's an economic return on that, right? If they can't find the subscribers. And there's an element of chicken and egg, right? Like if people haven't got, fast broadband, they don't know what to do with it. So when you ask them if they need it, they say no. Yeah. So there's that part of it. So you look at other countries, and sometimes people have been much more deliberate about actually saying, we're going to hit certain targets, or we want to leap certain technologies, or we think that it's critical, the same way we think it's critical for people to have access to, electricity or phone lines as did in the past. Mm-hmm. And I think I would argue pretty firmly that for a modern economy, a modern society, the idea that places should not be connected and able to participate, I really struggle with. And of course, if you ask people, these kind of amusing surveys of, the order in which you give up various, features of modern life, it's quite astonishing what people will surrender before they give up their mobile phone and their internet.
We're coming towards the end of the podcast. Thank you very much for being on, Chris.
You're very welcome.
I'd like to just ask you one final question.
Of course.
If there was any piece of fictional technology that you could click your fingers and would be there and would exist, what do you think that you would click your fingers and wish for?
Wow, that is an amazing question. What would I click my fingers and wish for? I think actually, one of the things that I struggle with is, there is so much being said and written and talked about. And despite the proliferation of channels, I still find it hard to kind of stay on top of all of that.
Yeah.
So something which actually kind of ingested the 1,000 documents in my reading list and told me the pertinent headlines would probably be a good thing. Beyond that, I would dearly love something which fix the climate crisis, right? I think that's the thing with a lot of us in this arena. You obviously you can't pin all your hopes on the technology, and we're going to have to find some economic solutions to a lot of the near-term challenges. But the kind of magical silver bullet would be something that rendered that much less of a concern for us and future generations.
Well, I think that was a great answer, and thanks once again for being on the podcast. You're more than welcome to come back on any time you like.
Fantastic. We've been really good. Thank you.
Well, thank you for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at Debated Podcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, subscribe to us on iTunes and Spotify, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you'll be here for the next one.